The bomb detectors that don't detect. Why did the British government help to sell them around the world? This week, a Newsnight investigation has found that the UK government helped sell so-called bomb detectors, which are now subject to a government export ban because they do not work and put lives at risk. We can also reveal that the devices are still being sold.
You've got to stop that, because this country, when it exports something, it should work, and particularly it should work when people's lives are at such risk.
Hello, it was marketed as the magic wand, an explosives detector supposed to help detect suicide bombers. But it simply didn't work. And after a Newsnight investigation exactly 1 year ago, the export of the detectors from the UK was banned because of the threat they posed to British and Allied troops. Now Newsnight has learned that between 2001 and 2005, a team from the army helped market the useless devices around the world. Devices which cost a few pounds to make, but are sold for £15,000 each. Caroline Hawley has the story.
Valletta, capital of Malta. And we've come to this tiny Mediterranean state on the trail of a deeply troubling international trade in which lives are at stake. Malta was one of the first countries targeted by the British sellers of suspected fake detectors, now being investigated by fraud police.
This is one of the so-called detectors. It's a plastic handle with an aerial which supposedly swivels in the direction of what you're trying to detect. But there are no working electronics in it at all. Despite that, they've sold in virtually every corner of the globe for everything from detecting bombs to drugs and ivory. They can cost as little as about £10 to make, but they've been selling for tens of thousands each.
And all sorts of organisations have been taken in.
There's an elaborate sales pitch that comes with them, and we've learnt that the Maltese police were persuaded to part with large sums of money for 2 of the devices. The prison service bought another one.
But the police were not the only ones to be approached. We now know that in the year 2000, salesmen also came here to Malta's Lucca airport. Patrick Kushkiri is now head of airport security, but back then he was in charge of dog handling teams, and he wanted to know if the so-called detectors could find a large stack of drugs he had hidden away.
We had a substantial amount of drugs kept in an area which I used for dog training, and if the equipment had to work as we were actually told, the area would have been triggered by the amount of drugs. We had cannabis resin, we had cocaine, we had heroin, and we had amphetamine sulfate. I knew something was wrong.
So if it can't detect drugs or explosives, why does the aerial move?
It's a toy. If I want the equipment to point at you, I'll just do that. If I want it to point at our colleague here, just do that. So it's just the way you swing your wrist, the aerial goes. If I just want it to go this way, I'll just do that.
These pictures show the Maltese army testing one of the detectors at Malta airport. According to British and American officials, the very place where the bomb that exploded over Lockerbie in 1988 was loaded onto a plane. It killed 270 people.
Although the British Army never used any of the suspect detectors itself, we've learnt that it was involved in promoting them abroad. The government has admitted that a team of Royal Engineers demonstrated them at arms fairs in several countries. It also admits that the Department of Trade and Industry helped market them in both Mexico and the Philippines.
The admission that the government gave export help between 2001 and 2004 came after a Freedom of Information request put in by Hayden Prowse.
The government were employing the services of British Army personnel to demonstrate these phony bomb detectors, which were proved by Newsnight to be completely ineffective, which effectively gave these bomb detectors a sort of British military stamp of approval, which allowed these companies to sell them to countries all around the world, many of which were combating insurgencies, which might, to my mind, have resulted in the deaths of untold people.
Baghdad, October 2009. A string of explosions that year took hundreds of lives and raised questions about how the bombs were getting through. And the spotlight fell on this, the ADE 651, widely used at police checkpoints. Iraq spent $85 million on the devices.
And see what's inside.
With the help of Cambridge University, we proved a year ago that it doesn't and cannot work. A card meant to detect TNT contained nothing but a cheap anti-theft tag incapable of detecting anything.
It couldn't be programmed then to detect TNT?
Absolutely not.
Is that all?
The government banned exports to Iraq and Afghanistan on the grounds the devices could endanger British or friendly forces. The suspect detectors first surfaced in the States in the 1990s. But after FBI warnings that they were a fraud, Britain became the new base for the trade. The first UK model was the Mole, the device sold to Malta. But after lab tests in 2002 proved it didn't work, the men behind it went their separate ways and sold them around the world under different names, among them the ADE 651, the GT 200 and the Alpha 6. Last year, police raided several businesses and confiscated hundreds of the devices. The Foreign Office warned countries around the world they didn't work, but no action has been taken to ban their export to countries other than Iraq and Afghanistan, because the government says the impact of any further UK action in preventing the supply of these devices from the UK would be limited if they're available elsewhere. But many concerned about the trade say that's not good enough.
It seems to me junk. My view is if this is being exported from our country as some kind of device that prevents bombs, it's got to be stopped based on the evidence I've seen. And I really think we've got to do something about it, and I will be.
The man who made millions from sales to Iraq, Jim McCormick, is still on bail after being arrested last January on suspicion of fraud by misrepresentation. Alarmingly, we've now learnt of a new attempt to interest British forces in a remarkably similar device. Look familiar? There are claims that the Head 1 can detect all kinds of explosives through concrete and steel barriers and up to 100 metres away.
Now, any damn fool can put enough explosive on a wall to blow a man-sized hole in the wall.
Sidney Alford is an explosives expert who makes the gatecrasher device used by special forces for hostage rescue. A range of his inventions are in use in Afghanistan to help defuse roadside bombs. Last year, he helped us expose the bogus detectors.
Speaking as a professional, I would say that was an empty plastic case.
Sidney Alford says he was astonished to hear just a few months ago that such devices were still being demonstrated on army ranges.
It is possible to be technologically very competent, but to be extremely naive in other directions.
And the man who showed the Royal Engineers the Head 1 is a retired Army Colonel, John Wyatt. We came to his offices in Kent to ask him why he was promoting it.
Hole there. It seems to me that if there's anything that has a positive outcome, even can help a little bit in what we're doing in Afghanistan or elsewhere, then we should look at it seriously. We shouldn't just dismiss it.
After the ban on the other detectors, the makers of the Head 1 distributed a statement saying they were a massive scam, but its device was completely different. In April 2010, John Wyatt displayed the Head 1 at the Olympia Counter-Terror Show and told customers it had proved extremely successful in several foreign countries.
It's intangible science to me that I wouldn't use it in a life or death situation.
But yet you still put it on your stand.
I put it on my stand because I want it to be looked at if you perhaps feel that they're gaining an edge by my involvement. I'd probably say, yes, I'm guilty.
John Wyatt would have made €3,000 profit on each detector, though the device he showed to the Royal Engineers has been confiscated by police and he hasn't sold any so far. But the manufacturer, a Bulgarian called Yuri Markov, has sold the Head 1 and a virtually identical device around the world. When the US Navy tested it in 2005, they concluded it does not work.
Presumably you know a bit of Yuri Markov's background, that the first version of this bomb detector, so-called bomb detector, was tested by the US Navy and conclusively found not to work.
Well, this is I have a problem with here, because independent tests which don't actually test it without guidelines inevitably can come to the wrong conclusions.
Yuri Markov was indicted for fraud by the Security Exchange Commission in the US in 2008 for declaring his device detected bombs when it didn't.
Yuri Markov was actually indicted for pretending that it did work.
Right. Well, again, I can understand if you look back into the 19th century where people are developing new sciences. Inevitably, if people don't understand the science, the not invented here syndrome, people are very cynical and critical.
We are looking out of that window there.
Sidney Alford does understand the science. He shows us how he conducted a double-blind test on the Head 1 to see if it worked. It failed to find 6 small samples of explosives and a much larger one.
This van contained more than 20 kilos of explosive. That's a lot of explosive. So, absolutely useless.
I mean, I do want to
John Wyatt says he wants the device properly tested before he actually sells any.
We know that the Royal Engineers did arrange for a test to be done and that it failed to detect 20 kilograms of explosives in a van.
Right.
Does that concern you?
It concerns me a little bit, but not entirely, because the guys weren't trained.
We'll never know how many lives have been lost because explosives weren't picked up by so-called detectors. What we do know is that the devices are still being used in many countries around the world and are still being sold.